Video, adding integers. There are a set of rules that apply to adding integers. Let's start with rule number 1. If you have the same sign integers, both positive or both negative, the rule is that you add the absolute value and use the common sign. So let's think about what that means. If I have 8 plus 12, the absolute value of 8 and the absolute value of 12 is 8 and 12. If I add those, I get 20, and I need to use the common sign. Well, the common sign was positive, so my answer is 20, a positive 20. In the second example, I have negative 6 plus negative 4. If I add the absolute value of these two numbers, I get the number 10. Now I need to take the common sign, which was a negative, which means my answer should have been negative 10. This is the rule for adding integers that are the same sign. What if they're different signs? Then you subtract the lesser absolute value from the greater absolute value and use the sign of the number with the greatest absolute value. Right? Let's look at the examples. If I have 5 plus negative 8, right? Let's find the absolute value of our two numbers, 5 and 8. It says subtract the lesser, which would be 5, from the greater, which would be 8. So 8 minus 5 gives me 3. Now I need to use the sign of the number with the greatest absolute value. Well, the greatest absolute value was negative 8. So my sign for my answer must be a negative. Let's look at this example. Negative 11 plus 13. Well, my absolute value is 11 and 13. 13 is larger, so the answer to this problem is going to be a positive number. I'm going to take my smaller number and I'm going to subtract it from my larger number. This gives me 2 because my larger absolute value was positive, then my 2 will be positive. The final rule is opposites. Remember, numbers and their opposites are on opposite sides of the number line. If I add two numbers that are opposite, then my answer will be 0. So if I take the number 7 and add to it its opposite, I'll get 0. Let's look at some examples. For rule number 3, there's a principle. The principle is called the introduction principle for oppositing, or for short we call it IPO. Here's an algebraic way of looking at it. If I have the variable x and I add to it the opposite of the variable x, I will get 0. Here's a numerical equation. 3 plus the opposite of 3 gives me 0. So if I have $3 and I owe $3, then I have $0. That's what we call the principle IPO. Let's look at this problem. Will the answer to this problem be positive or negative, and how do we know? Well, both signs are negative. The rule states that when you have the same sign, add the absolute values, and use the common sign. Well, because the common sign is negative, my answer will be negative. Let's look at the second example. I have negative 18 plus 75. We have different signs. We have a negative and a positive. The rule states that I should subtract the lesser absolute value from the greater absolute value and use the sign of the number with the greater absolute value. Well, if we look at the absolute value of these two, we have 75 and 18. 75 is larger, 18 is smaller. Because 75 is positive, then my answer will be positive. Let's find the sum of this example. I have negative 41 plus 30. Well, these are different signs. The rule for different signs is to find the absolute value of the two numbers and subtract. So I have 41 minus the smaller number 30, which gives me 41 minus 30, which gives me 11. Because 41 was the largest absolute value and 41 started out as negative, then my answer needs to be negative 11. Here's the second example. This time I have two of the same sign and they're both negative. Right away I know my answer is going to be negative. So now I'm just going to add the absolute value of the two numbers. 21 plus 34 gives me 55. Because they were both negative, I know that my answer will be negative. Here's an interesting example because it has three numbers. Start by adding the first two. I have negative 22 plus negative 13. They're the same sign, so I'm going to add and then use the common sign. 22 plus 13 gives me 35. They were both negative, so 35 must be negative. Now I'm going to add 6. One's negative, one's positive. The absolute value of 35 is larger than the absolute value of 6, so my final answer is going to be negative. Because they're different signs, I need to subtract. 35 minus 6 is 29. 35 was larger, so my answer is negative 29. Sometimes you need to evaluate an expression that is a variable expression. In this situation, A will be 8 and B equals negative 14. Start by substituting. A is 8 plus negative 23. I have different signs. The absolute value of 23 is larger than 8, so I know that my answer is going to be negative. Because they're different signs, I'm going to subtract. 23 minus 8 is 15. Because my larger absolute value was a negative number, negative 15 is my answer. Here's the second example. Negative 72 plus, I'm going to substitute negative 14 for B. They're the same sign, so I'm going to add and take the common sign. That means my answer is going to be negative. 72 plus 14 gives me 86, and it must be negative because the common sign was negative, and that's my answer. And this is the end of the video on adding integers.